Welcome to UCLA, everyone, and I think this is a terrific program. It's hard to think of anything that's more timely and more important, not just to the world, but to the university. We have a big stake in the issues of immigration, the flows of people around the world. We are an institution, and all institutions of higher education are devoted and dedicated to the free exchange of ideas and the free exchange of people, and to allow those people to come in and partake in what we have to offer. We also are dedicated to basic humanitarian values, the dignity of life, the dignity of individuals, the right to be able to live unmolested. And the flow of people around the world, the kinds of tragedies that we see every day, giving real emphasis to what was Bob Dylan's line an eon ago in my youth, pity the poor immigrant. It resonates now more than ever before. On the other side of it, we as institutions of higher education have a real obligation to study, to use our resources for the benefit of understanding what's happening in the world. And your assembly here, your combined resources are testimony to the way in which universities can marshal what they do best in the cause of something which is really, really important. And the more we understand problems, the more we can get to the root of things and project what we understand to the world, the better off we hope people will be. So this is a great opportunity. I want to thank you very much for coming and for being part of this. It's a wonderful thing. I also want to thank the co-organizers of this, Gail Kligman, the Associate Vice Provost for the UCLA International Institute. I have to read it to make sure I get it right. I know them both, but Roger Waldinger, where is he? Roger Waldinger, who's the director of the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. They've done a terrific job in bringing you all together, and I'm sure you're going to have an exciting time. I also want to thank the Luskins for their gift in making it possible for the Luskin Endowment for Thought Leadership, which was established in 2011. And I know Meyer and Rini, and I know this is exactly the kind of thing that they wanted to support and the reason they gave the money to UCLA. So thank you very much for attending. Have a great time, and welcome to UCLA. Bye-bye.
Okay, good morning. I'm Roger Waldinger, and I want to get us started by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Demetrios G.Papademetriou. Dimitri is an old friend. He's also a unique figure, I believe, in the world of migration policy and migration studies. He's someone who thinks about migration matters with exceptional clarity and insight. He possesses knowledge of the details of migration policy without ever losing the forest for the trees. And most importantly, most exceptionally, he's a great organization builder, having organized and led the Migration Policy Institute, MPI Europe, and the Transatlantic Council. So we're very pleased and grateful to have Demetri Papademetriou to begin our conference.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not quite sure that Roger's welcome and description is accurate, but it's nice to hear. The emphasis should be that we've been friends for 30 plus years now. And what I want to do today, I have a very long presentation. About half of it is charts and numbers and all that. I will go very quickly through that. I think it's important that we have a sense of the real numbers. I mean, if we're talking about a phenomenon that's as large or as small in country X or country Y, I think it's important for us to have a sense of size and importance, because nowadays size and how you get to that size, the large number of immigrants or refugees, but also how they come into our countries, is in many places responsible for quite a bit of the anxiety that people across advanced industrial societies seem to have with regard to immigration. Now I'm going to threw this thing up a couple of times, but I'll come back and fix it. This is the outline of what I will be talking about. I'll give you a second to sort of take a quick look at it. I try to go back with the data. I will talk a little bit about the US and the asylum and refugee data, because I want to make this lecture, which is primarily for what is happening outside of North America, also a bit relevant to what is happening in North America, and see where we can draw some distinctions or where there are some similarities that we ought to also talk about. The fourth one, I will not show you those slides beyond saying and demonstrating that Europe is no stranger to very large refugee and displacement issues. I mean, we have an image of Europe that is Europe of today, regardless of how long you have studied Europe, regardless of where you're coming from, et cetera, that this is somehow so much different than what has come before it. And in some ways it is. In so many different ways it is not. An awful lot of people, perhaps not any longer, say, well, if we managed to do so well within the Chinese crisis, and we resettled so many refugees so relatively easily, and we now sing the pans of how successful the Vietnamese were, and Cambodians, et cetera, why don't we do the same thing? It's only a few million Syrians, let's take them all in and do the same thing. And I want to give us a sense of not what happened within the Chinese crisis. Some of you are too young to even remember the wars, but I want to emphasize how unique the circumstances were there, and it all comes down to this, whether things are unique, sui generis, one-off things, or whether they create a new normal situation, and we need to treat the one set of issues differently in our head, and we're going to treat them differently in terms of policy. And then I want, and I'll spend 3/4 of my time on these last three or four parts. Everybody hears about the EU-Turkey deal. It's the ugly duckling in policy terms. Humanitarians hate it. They hated it from day one. They've tried to undermine it. They have been semi-successful, but the fact remains that the deal is there. It has had an enormous effect. It's not a solid, stable deal, but that has to do much more with the personality of the key actor in all of this, who's in the middle of all of this, Suleiman VI. I'm sorry. As you may know, Suleiman V, the Magnificent, was the most important Turkish leader. And I think Mr. Erdogan would love to be his successor in that history, the long arc of history in that part of the world. He's likely to succeed. We'll find out probably by the end of the month. And then I will use the word anxiety to describe what it is that troubles everyone, because anxiety has always been there, unhappiness has always been there, worries have always been there, and these last events in the last couple of years have, in a sense, the anxiety levels have risen. What's behind it? I will give you a sort of an advanced peek on this. It will sound strange to you, not only because we're all Americans, but also because you are Californians. And I will tell you what the secret word is there: integration. Okay? We don't understand it here. We don't have an integration with anything. States and localities know how to do it. This is part of what's uniquely American. But the concept that you should be investing zillions of whatever units of account, dollars, euros, etc., in trying to help people sort of become part of us, but in a very strange and formalistic way, rather than an integral way, that create where the newcomers and people who are already in a community work together to build community, and where change defines who we are. Those things are strange in Europe, and what Europe does are very strange to us. This misspelled number 8, the ingredients on the road to solutions. Well, what's an extra letter or missing a letter among friends, right? Not a big deal. And then a whole bunch of key judgments. You know, this is, in a sense, the sum total of what I think, not what I think, what I know, and I'm confident about, of what is going on out there and how we ought to think about all of it. So forgive me for going very quickly through the numbers. All right. These are data from the end of 2015. They're dated. The UNHCR, which is the official source for all of those things, will not release its 16 numbers until mid-year. Expect the 65 or so million people to come closer to 70 million. The displacement is going to be the largest, addition to the numbers. Displacement, of course, is 2/3 of the total numbers here. I think it's important for us, and the reason that I graphed it is for everyone to get an idea of, how the numbers have been behaving. You notice that the red line, which is internally displaced, people that didn't start sometime in 19, 3, because we didn't count displaced people until then. So at that time, prior to that time, we were talking about refugees, people who have already left their country and have sought, and here a refuge in another country, typically in the immediate neighborhood. Here, I think you should pay attention only to the first column under both producing and hosting. 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 countries account for, almost 50% in terms of the production of refugees, and also in terms, 6 or 7 countries in terms of the hosting of refugees. If I didn't want to do 5 and I wanted to put 7 there, you will see that in 2015, certainly in 2016, Germany would be there, as it was a few years ago. Germany, of course, whether you love them, you hate them, or you don't care, either way, have done something extraordinary. Whether they will succeed or fail will determine whether that something extraordinary was a good bet or a terrible, terrible bet. We won't know for a while. All right. This is the US data. You notice that we had large numbers in the early 1990s. Don't think that we somehow got very generous in the early 1990s. Nothing of the sort. The reason that we had all these large numbers because there were a couple of senators who were very interested in what was going on post-collapse of the USSR, and passed legislation with the consent or assent of their colleagues in the U.S. Congress that gave us those 120, 130, 140,000 people. So moving resources from adjudications and all that to develop all these new systems, et cetera, you have there an artificial dip. And there you see what Ann Richard managed to do last year. Hi, Ann. 80s, whatever it is, 81, 82, 83,000. And we are at about 40,000 this year. And the president has said that he will stop it at 50. We'll see what happens. These were the resettlement numbers. And these are people who are granted asylum. Somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people each year. So the total intake of the United States is at about 100,000, more or less. Add plus or minus 10%. Here's unaccompanied children and family units. This is a phenomenon that practically didn't exist until 2012. It went up very quickly from 12 to 14. It has stayed very high. and the latest data on all of this, both apprehensions at the border but also unaccompanied minors and family units, indicate that that those numbers the last couple of months have dropped dramatically. And, you know, clearly every refugee and most migration, with the exception of migration to the United States and Canada, are neighborhood affairs. So if you want to know where most of your immigrants will come from, you know, you look at your neighborhood. Most of your refugees, you look even more carefully at your neighborhood. So no surprise that what we're talking about here are people from the Northern Triangle and Mexico. I'm not going to go into the intricacies as to why the two flows are treated differently. Here is asylum and spontaneous migration in Europe. If this big sort of chart on the left confuses you, just look at the one in blue on the right. See what happened in the last 4 years from, you know, a few dozens of thousands in 2013, you're close to 200,000 in 2013, close to 200,000 in 2014, almost all of it through the central Mediterranean. There are 3 ways through which people are coming, and I call them, that's why the title says migrants, whatever, asylum seekers and refugees. These are mixed flows. It is maddeningly complex to separate out the one from the other from the third one. Political ideology ultimately determines what each analyst says that they are. If you simply apply hard rules, you end up with about 30 or so % refugees, 30 or so % people that you can't do anything about, can't send them back, can do this, can do that, so they stay, and then about 30 to 40%, depending on nationality, et cetera, people who are what we would call unauthorized immigrants, Europeans, because they're so much more polite than we are. It's a different world. They call them all sorts of euphemistic things, you know, irregular immigrants. Every time that I hear irregular, I feel that I have to run. Sorry, I apologize, it's early in the morning. So let's see if I, and here's the central, let me go back. And you see what happened in 2015. I will show you the graph for 2015 and help explain how and why it happened. And then you see 2016 back to about, it's doubled to 2014, close to 400,000 people. The interesting thing about that, and I'll give you the data, is the composition of that, you know, because by March of that year, 2016, virtually all movement across the Aegean, you know, almost halted, you know, from 80,000 for some months of the previous year to just about 30, 40, 50 per day, which makes it 1,000 to 1,500 per month. I don't know, the math is so dramatically different, you know, I can't even estimate, but I'm sure all of you have figured out what proportion of the drop that is. So 3 ways of entering Europe through the Mediterranean. The central Mediterranean has been the major route. Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, has been something that was never really active. You know, it doesn't mean that you didn't get a couple of thousand, but not active until sometime the middle in 2015, until March of 2016. And then the other one that's sort of like a sleeper, and for reasons that maybe we'll get to during the Q&A, getting to Spain, the Western Mediterranean. There are 2 ways to do that, either by trying to cross the Mediterranean, and that happens every day. Small boats, sometimes 20, 30 at a time. You know, think of them as organized. There is nothing that is not organized in these movements. If you have a sense that these poor people, you know, abandoned everything and they just, sort of will do anything to get on boats, they're just gonna climb all over each other, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing is further than the truth. This is completely organized, and there are people who facilitate. There's an entire industry. We want to think of them as bad guys. I try not to assign, those kinds of things to people. I see as the market operate in the way that the market always operates and will always operate. They're providing a service. There's a client, a very large client base, and they can charge pretty much everything that they want to, and they will make their money either in volume, which is what they did in the past couple of years, or in price. In other words, when it becomes more difficult, numbers are fewer, the price goes up 2, 3 times. And that's a different lecture, I suspect. Here's what happened in 2015 and 16 in Greece. And look at the red line. It is red up there? Good. In midsummer, in August, Frau Merkel announced that she would no longer insist that the Dublin regulation, which in a sense allows a country in the interior of Europe to send an asylum applicant back to the place through which that person got into Europe in the first place, which then meant that all of the people who made it to Europe would go back to Greece. Not exactly a reasonable proposition. And then a few weeks later, on September 5th, she basically opened the borders. I know the inside story on this. It's not a big, it doesn't require sort of gigantic, heroic kinds of assumptions. This was an emergency. 40,000 people were already at the borders. The Hungarians and the Austrians had it. You could see, and I mean this literally rather than, because I want to speak metaphorically, as far as the eye could see, there were phalanxes of people who were walking, the last 100 miles or 300 miles or whatever it is, sort of converging toward what at that time, and this is going to be a lasting image, although it's no longer deserved, at that time were the 2 newest promised lands in terms of protection, Germany and Sweden. And I will tell you that today there is very little of that promised land in either of those 2 places, but again, this is a conversation that I will have only if you want to have it. And you saw what happened in October and November, 200,000 people in a month. Let me assure you that there is no country or a collection of countries, not the richest country on earth, with immense resources, and that's Germany. I mean, we're the richest country and all that, but here's a country that was willing to put whatever it took in order to do this. You cannot process, you cannot register 200,000 people a month. We're now in 2017, and they're still struggling to make decisions about asylum claims. You can see, this is Greece, this is arrivals to Italy. Totally different flows. The people who came to Greece were primarily Syrians, Iraqis. It didn't last long enough for everybody to reroute themselves to get, to Turkey and then to Greece. And of course, Afghans, Pakistanis, and others. And there was an extreme reductionism during that year or so. Everybody, in terms of country of origin, everybody said that they were Syrians because that made it easier for them to just cross Greece. Everybody said that they were 18 or older because every country in Europe has a different responsibility, I guess, in the United States to treat minors a different way. So hardly any minors enter into Greece, lots of minors admitted in Austria and Hungary and Germany and Sweden and all that. And Of course, the Afghans have been a flow, and the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis have been a flow that has been coming into Greece for quite a while, maybe a decade. They just were used to coming further up north in the Evros River, which is the river that separates, it's the border between Turkey and Greece. So if we had this conversation in 2010, 11, 12, everybody would be talking about how poorly Greeks are treating all these people who are coming through the Evros River. Greece shut it down over the objections of wonderfully unthinking and other kinds of things Europeans who were complaining about their treatment and everything else, and not how you treat people at the border, but how poor the conditions were in, we call them detention centers, they call them reception centers. I mean, I'm telling you, the language is just fantastic. Reception centers. The commissioner responsible for all these things would go to Greece every 2 or 3 weeks and to go up there to these reception facilities and complain and punish Greece, etc., etc. It was messy. So the Greek conservative government at the time decided to do something about which it was universally attacked. It built a wall. Don't tell anyone. And all of a sudden, the flow stopped. And I mean stopped to near zero. And then moved further down. The famous balloon effect. We've experienced it in our own southern border, in many other places, that it's not all about shutting a particular route, it's about managing borders, and we all know that. The interesting thing is the flows through the central Mediterranean, and this is going to sound harsh, and I mean it. I want it to be harsh. I want you to say, what a son of a, what this guy is. You had people who looked a hell of a lot more like irregular immigrants, like unauthorized immigrants, illegal immigrants, than anything else. And in the easy days of the 2010, 11, 12, if you were Eritrean, you had 96% probability that you would be given some sort of status in Europe. And I will tell you that Eritreans live in a lousy country. They're forced to serve the government, for 7 years for a mere pittance. We have military services in other places for only 2 or 3 years. And if I were, or you were in Eritrea, you would try to get the hell out of there. But it's a different story between that and whether they actually are refugees according to the definitions, okay? And it's not just Eritreans, it is an awful lot of Nigerians and Ethiopians and others. And Europe had a fundamentally loose interpretation of the rules, because unlike perhaps us most of the time, Europeans most of the time and European governments most of the time really want to be generous. They really want to do things that will make them look very good to the outside and will also make them feel good about themselves, because beyond the issue of legal requirements, it's also about how you want to see yourself and what image you want to project. So by the late 2016, Eritreans practically disappear from the group, and what you have coming through the central Mediterranean in 2016 and the early months of 17 is, in a sense, people who left their home sometime in 15, and in some instances earlier than that, got stuck in Libya, because for a while it was a little difficult to try to make it out. And then they came up with sort of the perfect solution. Put them in any kind of a boat. It didn't have to be seaworthy at all, and it was not. Call, the rescue operations from Europe, 28 ships in all, and, you know, do that famous search, rescue, and complete the mission of both smugglers and their cargo by bringing people to Europe. The result is 200,000 people made it to Europe, and 5,000 people died last year. And those things go together. So I want to move to the refugee and displacement crisis in Europe since 1940. You know, it's a bit of a cheating, form of cheating by using the numbers, you know, in the period between 40 and 46. About 68 million people, 3 million of those were internal displacement. The largest numbers among those were the Volga Germans, you know, when Stalin decided that there are certain groups that were not to be trusted and moved them in a place where she could, I guess, control them and all that, and about 65 million in the rest of Europe. That includes over 11 million people who were forced laborers, who were just taken from all the places that Germany controlled during the war. A large number. Everybody compares the present with those days. I'm a bit of a disagreeable person when it comes to comparisons. I think comparisons are too easy. You have to understand what it is that you're comparing. Otherwise, it's not a useful comparison, but so be it. And then we've had the crisis that some of you will remember, the Hungarian crisis in '56. About 200,000 fled. About 180 of them actually stayed out of Hungary. They were resettled. The three giants of resettlement of all of these things were three countries, the English-speaking countries. Canada always punched above its weight, sometimes much, much above its weight. The United States punched below its weight, but had the largest numbers in most instances. After all, these people were fleeing, you know, the communism, so we were taking them in. Prague Spring, a lot of people left, but there was an amnesty, so you only ended up with having to resettle somewhere 25,000 or so. Again, most of them went abroad to Canada, Australia, and the United States. Germany. And this is a, you know, an interesting fact about Germany. Germany is really no stranger to large numbers. In this combined collapse of the Soviet reunification and collapse of the former Soviet of the Soviet Union, the USSR, that took place within the same 2-year period. Germany went from a few tens of thousands of refugees in '88 to, and then you go forward to 1995 when they changed their constitution, Article 50, either 15 or 16, which had been written by us, that basically required that anybody who came and said the words asylum, you know, had to be, you know, considered as an asylum seeker. And Mr. Kohl, over the objections, of course, of the left and humanitarians, basically rewrote the article, and it made it harder. It made it easier for Germany to deny status to people. So during that period of time, they got 1.6 million people. Close to 1 million of them actually stayed, in other words, were permanent. The second time, if you go to the last sentence here, started about the same time, and this was in a sense the Aussiedler, which means people, it's, you know, ethnic German. I don't want to use any other words. This is in a sense, think of it as the completion of the return of Germans who got ethnic Germans. Many of them had been wherever it is that they were, in Russia and elsewhere, since the 1750s, when Catherine the Great issued an invitation as part of her westernizing Russia, issued an invitation to all of these German tradespeople and farmers to come to the East. The East then became many different countries. And Germany has taken, since 1991, about 2 million people. These are the people who couldn't make it to Germany because of the of the Cold War and all this other stuff who got stuck behind the Iron Curtain. And when the Iron Curtain lifted, nice imagery, those folks were given privileged access to Germany. They came in as German citizens. They could vote. They could have access to all the services. Don't tell me 5 minutes. Is it? What is it? Thank you, Roger. All right, fine. She says, get moving. Okay, I'll finish. Can I finish my sentence, sir? I won't talk about the Indo-Chinese refugee countries, but crisis, but you'll see the resettlement of the Indo-Chinese. You know, we took about 823,000. Canada, Australia, big, others insignificant. France. You know, people forget why France took so many people. You know, if you really want to go back, you know, these were French territories or whatever you call them, colonies. There was this Dien Bien Phu in Indochina, you know, that kicked the French out about 10, 12 years before, 15, 18 years, whatever it is, before we did so well in Indochina, Vietnam. So that's why you have a large number over there. Otherwise, again, Australia, Canada, the United States, they also were the leaders in this global or international coalition that fought and lost the Vietnam War. So for anybody who thinks, why don't we do that with Syria, you know, apples, oranges, apples, widgets, apples, something else. They're always idiosyncratic. I think my view and my worldview, circumstances that determine what is possible politically and what is not possible politically. So, 23 minutes to talk about mostly Europe. You know, there was a little thing about an EU-Turkey deal. Really, this also marks the beginning of two fundamental changes, geopolitical changes in Europe. The first one is that Germany stopped leading from behind, which is exactly what Frau Merkel did for 10 years before that time. I don't know how you lead from behind, but anyway, you know. In other words, you let everybody else screw up, and then you say, how about if we do this, and then you sort of win. It also, in a sense, displayed for everyone to see I'm going to have to try to be polite here, the relevance of the European Union and the European institutions on issues that matter. And as a result, you know, one of the victims, besides the people, in all of this is indeed the Brussels institutions that are never likely to fully recover from the fact that, you know, they have no role, they have played no role in all of this except to talk. Believe me, I talk with them all the time, so I talk too. So what was this deal? The deal was, and they don't call it an agreement or a deal, they call it a statement to show you where Europe is with the language. It's a wonderful little booklet of Europeanisms. In other words, what did the European Union do to the English language? It's about 80 pages. It's the most fascinating thing that you'd ever want to read. Anyway, in return for 6 billion euros starting in 2016 through 2018, EU funding, but when we say EU funding, the EU meaning the Commission puts in a minority, you know, a relatively small amount of money, because leadership also implies digging deeper in your pocket. So most of the money comes from Germany. It's going to be remarkable to see when Germany may say enough is enough, but Germany had an amazing surplus. Last year, the economy is going gangbusters, so they're not going to say enough is enough yet. And here are the 5 or 6 things that the Turkey deal tried to do, and where they stand now. They're targeting smugglers, Erdogan decided to do it, and it's operational, or in other words, it has worked. He also tackled fraud and all of these officials that were involved in taking the money. He shut down all the stores, so most of the stores that sold, these rafts, et cetera. In other words, he put resources, and the flow essentially stopped, hence the word operational. As a result of that, the crossings across the Aegean is, next to nothing, as I said, 1,500 per month for the last full year. Not a significant number because there's no ripples. I'll explain in a while why. But it is a bone of contention. Everybody threatens everybody else. Erdogan says, we're going to do this and that and the other thing, but he's an actor of the highest quality and power, and we'll see what he really means with all of this after he becomes president. Support for Syrian refugees in Turkey. There has been an enormous progress on this. Some really smart things. I don't have time to go into them, but a simple decision that the humanitarian people at the EU decided to do only a few months ago, where they actually gave debit cards to people who were in Turkey as refugees. This way they can spend money in the local economy. This way the local economy would benefit. This way the reaction to them as a result is going to be muted. All of those things go together. And there's been quite a bit of progress on this. Kids have been educated, not nearly as high a proportion of them. There are over 700,000 kids, school-aged kids in Turkey. Only about 400, only about 60% of them are in some sort of schooling. Everybody gets it, that if you don't educate the kids, you're going to lose an entire generation. Lost generations mean that whatever happens to Syria, who the hell is going to put Syria back together again if you don't have, young people and children who are educated? People get that. Some initial efforts, not enough in terms of giving work authorization to Syrians. There is reaction at the local level on this, but progress has been made. The big bullet there, it's an irrelevant bullet. Everybody was upset about the famous 1 for 1. Greece sends back 1 Syrian to Turkey. Turkey accepts it, and Germany, Europe, takes a different Syrian through a resettlement process, okay, and brings them to Europe. You see the total number, 1,487. And of course, what Turkey wanted more than anything else was visa-free travel, and of course, reopening negotiations. I will certainly die, even if I live to be 100, before Turkey is a full member of the European Union. But this visa-free travel did not have to be a hard issue. Okay? Everybody gets the image that all of a sudden, 80 million Turks and 40 million Anatolians, peasants who know nothing, would just get visa-free access to Europe, and they'll get into Europe and try to work illegal nonsense. Okay, there are already about 5 or 6 million Turks who already have visa-free access to Europe. They tend to be the intellectuals, professors, business people, and all that. The only thing you needed to require is that these people, the people who would want to have that kind of passport, would be vetted. They would be vetted in any way, and that number would gradually rise, 6, 8, 10, 15 million, and would stay essentially steady. But things that are easy, Europe makes hard, and things that are hard, Europe makes impossible. What the EU really wants, we all know what it wants, It wants the flows to stop coming in the size and in the manner in which they have been coming to Europe. That's their number one, that's probably their only priority. And people, and I've had this conversation with far too many senior government people, the people who cut the deal, et cetera, they say, we did it through Turkey. In reality, the Turkey statement, the Turkey deal is of slightly less importance in all of this than the initiative that the Austrians have taken with both the sotto voce support of Germans and others, sotto voce, but on the surface, over the objections, because Europe loves to talk from both sides of its mouth at the same time, over the objections of Germany and some of the others. They closed the Western Balkan route. Listen, the last thing that refugees are is stupid, okay? They don't want to be stuck in Greece. There is nothing for them in Greece. It's a broke country, a country that will not play by the rules, a country that would love to say everybody has a right to come to Europe as long as they move on to Europe. Okay? So once you close their route beyond Greece, it made no sense for them to continue to come. I'm not saying that the EU-Turkey deal was any relevance. It was not. But it is the hard action of all of these other countries with the support of the EU, Italian, agents, control agents at the border, now substantial numbers of the EU and the new entity of the European Union, which is sort of like the Coast and Border Patrol Agency. It's the same thing that we used to call something else, but they wanted to say that this is something new, okay? So it was all of those things together trying to stop people from moving beyond Greece. There is a seepage, a leakage out of Greece, because it's obvious that if Greece receives about 1,500 a month additional people, the numbers is staying, thank you, 15, thank you. The number is staying at about 50,000 people. It's just people are going around Macedonia, et cetera, it's harsher terrain if you try to go through Albania. Bulgarians are not nice to refugees. So, and then even if you make it into Bulgaria, you still have to cross European borders further up. So you have to cross two sets of borders. So it becomes, in a sense, a much more difficult way to get into Europe. And as a result, not masses of people are trying it. And of course, they want to buy time to see whether things can change in Syria or Turkey, for that matter, without applying any political foreign policy resources to do so, because foreign policy in EU is a contradiction in terms. Boy, I'm hard on them today. The second one, persuade reluctant EU member states to take in, resettled refugees. This is leading to, to a big argument. There has been a big argument all along. Everybody is trying to sort of like up the ante in terms of threats. There is a solution there. There's always a solution. The solution is lowest common denominator. Some countries are demanding that those countries that don't play in terms of relocation or resettlement should be thrown out of the union, should be penalized, should be that, should be this. What the EU decided back in May or June of 2015, and through a formal decision in September of 2015, the relocation decision, is as classic a definition of Pyrrhic victory when it comes to these issues in Europe as any that I have come across in at least 40 years of studying Europe. They decided to invoke a qualified majority ruling, whereby the majority forced its way on the minority. And that minority swallowed hard, and then said, "I'm going to play." And that's what you have in Europe an hour and a half later. And you'll see that out of this 160 lousy thousand people, which is not even a drop in the ocean, okay? Only about 14,000 have been relocated, and there are two reasons for that. Countries won't take them, and the second one that we don't like to talk about, so I'll whisper it. Refugees want to go where they want to go. If you think that this is about protection, please think again, okay? Nobody wants to go to Portugal, to Spain, to about 60% of the European destinations that really have not been particularly affected by the crisis. The crisis has concentrated on about 10 countries. And if you take the numbers for all of these 10 countries together, 9 of those 10 countries together, and add them up, they still come to roughly 90% as many as a single country has absorbed. That's Germany. And and of course, the global response. I love people who, talk about a global response in resettlement as if, we're going to resettle anywhere near enough people to make a difference over there. Resettlement, in my book, and I know lots of people will disagree with that, it's about who we are, rather than about doing things that will have an extraordinary effect in that universe of people who need protection or resettlement. What Turkey wants, first and foremost, Erdogan wants to be respected. You can sing that song that whoever he was, respect. Who was it? Come on, you guys. There's Aretha Franklin. There's some old-timers here, right? They want to be the ultimate arbiter, so what happens in the region, they're there. Russia has made them that. They still want safe zones in Syria. The new administration will probably move in that direction. Not the all safe zones where you have to protect them, et cetera, but places where the internally displaced can go until something happens. And of course, he wants to play out his passions against all Kurds, and that has been enabled, as it were, because of Russia. I don't think he's going to, manage to really be effective in that regard. Anxiety. People are anxious about how fast those flows grew and the chaotic way in which they appeared. I mentioned earlier that image of, as far as the eye can see, there were people walking, phalanxes of people walking. That's a jarring kind of an imagery. The initial reaction, of course, was to open our hearts, our minds, and our wallets, to welcome these people in Austria's train stations and in Munich and all of these other places. But, some of that gets very old very quickly. And indeed, we have seen a turning around in terms of most people, although I must say that the ones that we hear from most regularly are the humanitarians, who are really doing a good job in terms of trying to make us feel that we ought to be doing better. And of course, the inevitable argument about Muslims, religious distance. This is not just in the rhetoric of our president. This is felt really deeply in a lot of parts of Europe. A combination of the fact that an awful lot of people in Europe and governments in Europe feel that they really screwed up when it came to the Muslim integration, and that sort of fuels the fires of, my God, we're going to get many more Muslims. We have problems with what exists now, which is only partially true. It involves only some Muslims. It involves them in only some countries. But nonetheless, the narrative becomes sort of undifferentiated when you talk generally about these things. And of course, visibility and otherness. We experience this, all immigration is visible and other. There is not something. people, and this is a diverse audience, but if this was an all-white audience, I would say, immigration, people who come in are not going to look like us. I had that argument in the late 1980s with Congress, with senators and all that, who wanted to increase immigration but keep it European. Say, you can't have your cake and eat it too. People will come to the United States for reasons that the Europeans don't see as important any longer. So yeah, you get quite a few Europeans. They are the most dynamic ones, et cetera, but if you're going to be in the immigration business, you're going to be in the immigration business where diversity and otherness will define that business. And the key takeaways are that it is not only each society's management model that has come under question, but public trust in the ability of governments to manage immigration well has disappeared. It hasn't, I'm saying here eroded because I want it to be nice. It has disappeared. And the basic governance challenges, I've mentioned 3 here: apprehensions about immigrant integration. I won't discuss the other 2, but I will say a few things about it. In each country, some immigrant groups have these characteristics. They have fallen behind, and systematically so, in terms of language ability, educational achievement, access to opportunity, employment, earnings, health access, quality of housing, and social and political engagement. This has created a sense of cumulative disadvantage, which has isolated and marginalized entire communities, and it has bred mutual wariness. So the communities feel aggrieved that they're being put upon by the majority community, and the majority says, but they are not adopting our values, our ethos. They don't do things the way that we do. This is a perfect way, sorry, got excited. This is a perfect way to create nothing but mistrust and suspicion. Roger tells me that I have to skip all that. I'll go to 2 judgments. There are no magic bullets left any longer. We've run out of them. I don't know that we ever had any, but whatever it is, when we sort of opened up the box, we found it to be empty. And everybody thinks that the governance function of all of these countries has proven simply unequal to the task. And the natural centrifugal forces that every society, every system has have gotten stronger over the past years. The Turkey deal is always, on the brink of unraveling. Italy, Germany, and Brussels are chomping at the bit. This is true. I mean, if you look at the agreements, Malta has the EU presidency in this 6 months that end in the end of June. If you look at all the papers, including the papers that are not public about all of this, you can see that they're all dying to declare the Libyan government that has been recognized as fundamentally in control of Libya, which is not going to happen. This way, they can just do 2 things: the search, rescue, and complete the goal of smugglers and their human cargo. Will simply redirect the people instead of taking them to Europe, take them somewhere else, and have their claims examined there. And eventually, if that works, but not well enough, find external processing zones and centers to do their job. Difficult under the most ideal circumstances. But nonetheless, governments, because there is this jamboree of elections between the Netherlands last March and the Austrians until next March, Germany, you have France, you have the Italians, which may be in the summertime, because I'm not quite sure that this government will survive, the Swedes, et cetera, everybody's playing defense, everybody's, sort of tries to engage the populist right, and I think that we're going to find ourselves in a period of time where lots of things that were thought to be impossible and they may smell really badly, that may in fact become what it is that they're going to do. So more. One of the good things that have happened, people, you know, part of the Turkey deal are moving very well in terms of education and kids and work permits, but more importantly, the fact that deal has been extended to Jordan and Lebanon, small places that are extremely divided, that are extremely poor, that need assistance, because if they come apart, the Middle East goes to hell. They have, you know, made a decision they're not going to have more of the same, and they've been successful so far. There is a buyer's remorse in most countries, both about illegal immigration and the vetting size and geographic distribution of asylees and resettled refugees. As you know, there is a revolt among U.S. states and governors about accepting resettled refugees. Don't know whether it's an inflection point or a bump in the road, only time will tell. Nothing but textbook cases of Hobson's choices. Not only have we run out of choices, but the ones that remain are all difficult. Restoring legality on borders is essential. Terrorism now has been on top of the agenda, and it will continue to be so. You're going to see more attention, money primarily, on first asylum and transit countries. Humanitarian impulse, it's not clear to me who will win on whether the impulse to be open or the impulse to close. Don't know which one will come out. Integration, again, remains the policy terrain on which immigration policies will succeed or fail. If the sense, and the numbers are terrible. If you look at the German numbers, through 2013 to date, only 13% of the people who entered as migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees say that, I lost my thought, only 13% of them are working. We all listened to BBC, everybody was a doctor, a graduate student, etc., etc. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we can discuss this because people don't understand how labor markets operate in Europe. This isn't the United States where you just expand your labor market and everybody gets a $9 an hour job. Okay? You have to understand this in order to understand why there is such a hard time. Final slide. We're in an age where we're questioning everything. Multilateralism is at an inflection point. The words of the president, my job is to represent the United States of America, not the world. You will come, we will have a new equilibrium point for a while. The equilibrium point constantly shifts. We don't follow it closely enough to see those shifts. A new equilibrium point between state interests on the one hand and values on the other. And as of yesterday, this final picture there, cartoon, is particularly relevant. Anyone thought about putting out the fire? I don't know. We certainly bombed the hell out of a particular place in Syria yesterday. I don't know whether this is the beginning of trying to put out the fire, but that's a big question. Thank you.